right, welcome everyone back to the EOF implementers call. Today, I don't actually know which number we are because we stopped tracking on the PM repo, but we must be around like 35-ish, 36. Let's start with the client updates. Dano, you're first on this list, so please go ahead.
Sure. So over the weekend, I started implementing TXCREATE. There's a lot of overhead in creating a transaction for this, so I want to bring that up as a issue after we go through the client update. But it's there's a lot of moving pieces to bring in a new transaction type. And I'm still not done. I still don't have it fully implemented. The things still wiring things through into all different locations on the client. So that's the status of besu. That's all the changes that happened from last week.
All right, let's discuss the transactions after the round. Dragon, do you want to go next?
Yeah, for my side, I was most focused on verification of EOF. I'm passing around 80-90% of the vector tests that are on Ethereum tests. So yeah, I'm mostly doing that. I see that some of them are not updated and some things are missing, but yeah, going through them. Maybe I have one question about that. What's basically the newest spec on the Ethereum test? I saw that there are a few PRs, but we can cover that later.
Sounds good. I was also was just loading the readiness matrix. So wanted to ask first you, Dragon, if the readiness matrix reflects where you are, and then also Deno.
It should probably be updated. Some of the things are work in progress. Some of the things are there, but not well tested. But yeah, it should be updated that most of the EIPs are in work in VIP. Some of them are even considered maybe done. I will update this after the meeting.
Thank you. That sounds good. Deno?
Yeah, let me finding it again. Yeah, it's correct. 7620 is still under construction. That's TXCREATE. Caveat, this is pending upon updates of testing. So a thumbs up doesn't represent fully tested because not all of the reference tests are written.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, Epsilon, who wants to give the update on EVM1? Please go ahead.
We have merged EXT calls, and we have merged EVMC changes required for TXCREATE. And so the final things left are EOF create and TXCREATE, which are ready but still not merged. They're still on review. That's it.
And is the readiness matrix reflecting this? So readiness matrix says 7620 is under construction. Everything else, it claims to be done.
Yeah, I just pushed the update before the meeting. It's correct.
Awesome. All right, Peter, do you want to give an update on the spec?
Yeah, in terms of the spec, the EIP update for 7069, the EXT calls was merged last week. And I think that's all. The 3540 and 4750 are still in review. And 5450 is, I think it's stale right now, and we're sort of, I think, preparing to pick up working on it. And that's it. And we have a bunch of discussions on the specs, I think, today. Maybe later.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Peter. So we have Alex on the call. I'm not sure if you're working with a client, but feel free to do a very short intro if you have a working mic.
Yeah, hello. I'm sorry for joining the call. I got a link from your Vice. I just wanted to learn more about the EOF for the purpose of like how it can be used with our work on account abstraction.
Sounds good. Yeah, let us know if you have any questions during the discussion we're going to have in a second. Barnabas, do you have any updates from the DevOps side? I think we have some updates from our side.
I'm ready to test whatever you guys have. If you have a working branch, I'm happy to start a DevNet for EOF.
All right, sounds good. Well, we're going to see on this call. All right, let's start the spec discussions. Peter, I believe you do have a list, so maybe the mic is over to you then.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of discussions that have been happening on Discord. I do have a list. Maybe I'll just run through the list quickly and then we can pick something that we find most important. So there has been a discussion about TXCREATE-less EOF, which I think resulted in not pursuing this idea because TXCREATE has a valid use case. And now there's this actually an original discussion that the TXCREATE-less one spun off of is whether we want the irregular state change for the creator contract or some legacy-like deployment facilities for EOF to appear in the state for the first time, because then on, like, the assumption right now is that only EOF can deploy EOF. Next, we were I think we had a discussion about status codes from EXT calls last time. We were supposed to do a write-up of the current status of the status codes, which I think we don't have right now. So maybe that's not a good time to discuss. And then there was a suggestion that we have more strict initcodes transaction validation rules from Dano. Was specifically that there was supposed to be no empty initcodes and no lacking initcodes or empty array of initcodes in the initcode transaction. That was Dano's suggestion. And then there's the ban origin thread as well. And then there's the thread that we might want to validate containers, to split containers during validation into init containers and runtime containers, as we call them. And the first of them can only call return contract, and the other kind cannot. We can validate this during validation with some limited difficulties, but I think it's a viable suggestion. So anyone wants to pick a topic? Maybe I'll just paste this list into the chat so that you can see it.
Maybe I would suggest if we set aside like 5 minutes for the status codes, then we can finish that. Probably a transaction creation discussion is going to be a big one.
Let me fix this. I'm fixing this very quickly.
So regarding the status codes,
we have four topics, okay. And status codes. Actually, I just dropped status codes because we don't have the write-up ready.
Okay, yeah, that was my
Go
question.
ahead. Go ahead.
If anybody wrote it.
Go ahead, Alex. I didn't catch that.
Is my mic not working?
No. I think we talked over each other.
Yeah, I was talking about the status codes, and I was going to ask if anybody did the write-up.
Not that I'm aware of. I think Pavel wanted to start it or kick it off, but then I think he got involved into something else. he's not here today.
All right, should we start with this Deno's suggestion, no empty initcodes filled? Maybe we time box it to 10 minutes. I want to give like 30 minutes to the creator contract legacy stuff, because that seems to be the biggest, most important discussion.
Yeah, so while implementing the initcode transaction, I was comparing it to some of the things done in the blob transaction, some of their validation rules. One of the rules they have for validation for the blob transaction is it must contain a blob. So people don't try and use a blob transaction to try and sneak regular transactions in that don't have blobs. You know, that was one of the ACD decisions. So to correspond with that, the proposal would be to require that an initcode transaction have at least one initcode section, and that each initcode be at least length 1 or longer. So we don't have an array of an array of 1 0 length initcode would be an invalid transaction. So no initcode list would be invalid. A list that is empty would be invalid, and a list containing an empty initcode would be invalid. So all the initcodes need to contain actual initcode, and there must be at least one, is the short description of how I would think a valid transaction. Now, as far as validation, it is specified there is no concern about validating the exact body of the EOF, so it could be any random bytes, and we can still validate the transaction. And this is a very simple rule that can be implemented at transaction handlers without knowing anything about the EVM or EOF. So I think that would improve it without putting undue validation rules on those who don't care about EOF and need to process the transaction.
Anybody wants to bring up some opposing points?
I like the consistency argument, and like all the arguments I think are. I had that just small issue that we allow 256 of these init codes, and like all but one can be of length 1, and then the last one is empty. Is that no way to be a problem? And I don't know if 256 is too small a number for this to be a problem, that this is gonna be too much work to do during the transaction validation.
It shouldn't be a process. It shouldn't be a problem at all, I would think, because
Okay.
consider the situation of a large call data one. You got to read the call data and read through all the bytes and move to the end. Here you might be doing 256 stream interruptions and get the length of each stream interruption and make sure it doesn't exceed the init code size, and make sure that it is at least 1. So we're already checking each of the potential 256 ones to make sure that it is not larger than the init code, which is already written in there. So that's just another check to make sure that it's at least it's at least 1.
Are we checking the length of the init code at that point?
Yes, it's written in. It's an invalid transaction if it exceeds the init code. At least I seem to recall. Let me double check the text.
I thought we check it once it's invoked with TXCREATE, but I might be wrong.
We also check it there.
Okay. Is this in the Megaspec?
Yeah, it's the first rule of transaction validation. A netcode transaction is invalid if there is more than max initcode entries in the netcodes, or if any one exceeds max initcode size.
All right. Okay.
So the proposal there would be to say, or if length is 0. And then another bullet point item saying that there must be at least one entry in initcodes.
Okay, and then in that case, my issue is void. So
And there's like a meta issue that's not in the spec that is more operational. Clients like Get won't gossip transactions larger than 128K, although transactions larger than 128K can show up in the chain. So that might be worth calling out in the spec, but it might not be as a security consideration.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense.
Sorry, what do you mean by this? It won't pick it from the mempool or won't transmit it in the mempool?
It won't transmit it to any other mempool other than its own. So there's a mode you can switch get in. If you submit it via RPC to its mempool, it'll accept it if it's larger than 128K, but it won't gossip it out. So this has kind of been an issue for some L2s posting. L2s are fully aware of it. So they limit their call data so that the entire transaction is less than 128K, but now it's completely moot because everyone's moving to blobs. And I think that's where the 128K number for blobs became attractive, is because it's already established in the clients.
So that means if we still have, well, actually the initcode limit is double the code size limit. So it means there can only be like 2.5 contracts before we hit this limit.
Full contracts. Full contracts.
Sorry.
2.5 full contracts. And then you got to consider
2.5 full initcodes. Yeah.
The gas limit of the block is also going to provide some realistic limitations on that too. Because I think the initial contract limit it was 6 mega gas was what the initial 24K limit would have done. So it wasn't an issue when they first proposed it. So yeah, you could only do 3 full contracts in a current block, or 5 if you're gonna go into the extra space. So there's already ergonomic limits to the maximum size of what you can do in this anyway. And I think the 256 size was initially proposed when TXCREATE was going in via index. So that also didn't make any sense to have anything more than 256.
Yeah. So my question is, do we want to stick with the 256 limit, or it's kind of pointless and we want a lower limit, or we can just ignore it as long as we document this effect?
If we do a limit, I think we should limit the size of the entire transaction body. So maybe we say the transaction body can be no more than 4 times the maximum code size, or 128K. I'm not sure which.
Right.
Because if we use 256 as the max, you can make a transaction as large as 12 megabytes, which is gigantic.
Yeah, it does seem like it's kind of pointless if it won't be gossiped. But conscious about time, I wonder if the next best step is, since you're working on this, if you would maybe come up with a proposed spec change for next week, and then we can agree on it.
Yeah, I'll post it.
Awesome. All right. Any other comments before we move on? Okay. Should we try to discuss the validation question regarding return contract? But we have to time box it to like 8 minutes. So whoever proposed that,
I don't remember who proposed that. I can say that I think I'm more in favor of this.
I'm sorry, my headphones went out. What was the question again?
The return contract validation during EOF validation, so that you cannot return contract from a container which is not used as an init container.
That was Charles.
That was Charles. But I think this idea also floated during Istanbul or somewhere. I think I'm supportive of this. Is it in the vein of ban something first, and then if there's a valid use case, just unban it? Ban meaning not allow have this validation requirement, so that the container is either an init container which runs a return contract in the end, or and is referenced from an EOF crate, or is in the initcodes field.
Could do that.
And then And then the other class is runtime container, as we call it, which is allowed to return and stop, and also is not used in EOF create and initcode. I think this can be somehow weaved into. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
My concern with introducing a new container type that it's a runtime or init, it would increase complexity of validation without getting any real return value. I think a simpler one that containers can only be referenced by a return contract or a EOF create, and not both, I think is a much more sustainable approach to get this goal that you can't mix them up, but also there's a functional thing that you can't really do both. I mean, there's a lot of effort for a harm that I'm not even sure is well articulated. But this was Charles pushing for it, and he's not here today to give a full defense on it, but Mike, I don't want to upend the validation process for a harm that we're not even sure exists.
But I didn't quite follow. You would have a simpler validation rule, or just not have it at all?
I would have if we have either no validation rule or a simpler validation rule, such that a subcontainer, all subcontainers must be referenced by either return contract or EOF create, and a subcontract can only be referenced by one kind of instructions. It can only be accessed by EOF create, or it can only be accessed by return contract. So you can't mix them, and everyone has to be referenced.
But then you don't go inside these containers to see whether they use or not.
No.
Okay.
No.
Okay, got it. Oh, that works as well.
Yeah, I think that works, though, but to me it also seems like a complication of validation. We'll have to have this global list of like which instructions reference which subcontainer, like global across all code sections validation.
Right. So it's going to be one array for the entire code validation for the whole subcontainer. It takes one of three values: unreferenced, EOF referenced, or return contract referenced. So yeah, it does require a new global state, but I don't think the overhead's terribly high. And I'm also okay not putting it in if people feel it's too much validation overhead too. But if we want to verify that subcontainers are used, we're going to have to track this somehow. So in addition to making sure that the subcontainers are accessed only one way, this is also a way we can guarantee that there are no dead subcontainers.
Yeah, this makes sense. It seems like we're kind of against introducing these rules. Main reason being just not complicating it.
If that's the conclusion, I'm cool with it.
Yeah, I think if we don't get rid of these runtime checks for return contract and return and stop, then like I think it's not worth it to complicate the validation. If we do have these checks, then what I don't like is that like subcontainer validity depends on the outer container instructions. So like validation of subcontainer is not isolated.
Yeah, that's his smell.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll make a note of this, and then there's gonna be some updates to the Rationale section in the Create EIP, and I'll just post it there. And if there are no more comments, I think we can proceed. Alex?
Yes, I think we do have the 30 minutes for the either contractless EOF. Yeah, I'm not sure who wants to lead the discussion, but yeah, Peter or Dano, but please get started.
I'm making notes right now, so maybe someone else.
I'll go ahead and start. So this was some of the thinking that came to my mind as I was implementing some of the TX to create and trying to go through the final flow of how stood up testnet would work. And what I realized is that none of the tooling supports getting EOF contracts as specified. Because when you do a create contract in like Foundry or Hardhat, they don't know where this, they'd have to write an entirely different flow to do a contract call to deploy an EOF, which seems kind of counterintuitive that you have to set it to a magic address. It's definitely away from the current standard of how you deploy legacy contracts. But I think the reason we got to this place was because the desire to get rid of code introspection. We wanted to make sure that none of the EOF code ever hit like call data or memory or return data. We were trying to pull that completely out. And so we swept all of the places that include at the time the legacy create, not legacy, or the existing create transaction, the create modes of transaction type 0, 1, and 2. I think 3's got a create. No, 3 can't do a create mode. But my concern here is that because the tooling doesn't support it, that we're going to possibly meet with market rejection with this if we change something unnecessarily. And I think the engineering compromise to use the existing create mechanism isn't as odious as it might seem. So my proposal would be to allow for EOF to be added in a create transaction for type 1, 2, and 3 transactions. You just put the entire create in the call data. And so that starts up when it detects the EOF right now. The contract create transactions, when they see something start with an EF, they just shut down the whole transaction. It's invalid. That's per the 3451 rule. I think that's the one that comes after the initial EOF container, but where we were reserving the EF for EOF transactions. So when you see the EF, you go to the same creation flow that you would do. You'd start up an EOF, you'd validate the container, you'd start a message frame with EOF init create, but you would not put any of the code in the call data. You would just execute it all as initcode. And so that would require a couple of other changes in that we accept any added data on the end to also be considered part of the container. So then we would need to rewrite the container as though that was added on in aux data implicitly. So whatever you paste on, so you paste on a code like a code that would be the pair contract, and then you would append your 2 addresses for the pairs therewith. And so we would see it's an EF start with the process. We would create the same message frame as though we were doing an EOF create. At the root level, there just would be a parent. This is very typical for the way the EVM would work. And then we would just set no values for call data, and the call data would be the init code, and we would rewrite it so that it's valid, so that the data that was added on at the end was added on as though it was aux data, and we just update the data header size. And then we would execute it from there. So they could take that extra data and they could use that, or we could have the extra data at the end of it be call data, is another approach that we could do. They could access it via call data in there. So, Peter?
Yeah, I think the way to supply data into this initcode execution frame is it can be simpler because the init container has the data section, and this
right
initcode can just do data load. Right. So
yeah. So yeah, we could just do that. I mean, the compilers would need to be aware of that and know that it's going to be added on as aux data, but they're going to need to be aware of that anyway for EOF creates as well. So it's code they're going to have.
It's not even aux data because you don't need a special rule for validation and like the structure of the container. It's just what we call, I think, this static, not even static, so like the data section that is always in the container, and it's in sync with the data section size field in the header. So it's just a place to put data in, and you can use it.
It may not be fixed sized. Imagine you're creating a DAO contract and you're having a list of people who are authorized to be admins. That's a dynamic array, so you won't know when you compile it how long your data section needs to be.
But that's the deploy container, and that can do all these aux data funny thing. But when you send the init code, you can, that's the moment when the compiler produces the init container, it will know how much space it should, reserve in the data section and put their data there.
Right. It would update the data section and execute it with that, or we could have a validation rule to accept it afterwards. So yeah, it can be done without much. It can be done in code without having much disruption to existing tooling. So that's my main motivation for wanting to make this engineering change to the way that the create transactions work, because I'm really concerned that having to change the create flow is going to result in huge market rejection. It's the very first way that they interact with EOF, and if they have to hop through new hoops, they're just not going to do it. I don't think, unless we can demonstrate 20% code reduction, it's not going to happen.
It does make a lot of sense to have previous or legacy flow of creating new bytecode. This would basically remove that contract that we have about EOF create, not EOF create, but hard-coded contract. Yeah, TXCREATE.
Yeah, it would be optional. Like if you want to deploy many contracts in one swoop, look, 2.5 contracts in one swoop, and you use it. And also when you want to, I guess, have the smart contract wallet deploying thing.
Yeah. So that's the deploy contract is another thing that has been tickling an allergy for the irregular state change. Since the DAO and seeing the problems it created, I really don't like the idea of just randomly dropping state into the code as part of a hard fork. Part of it's because of social political, and part of it is because of practical. In that, how do we coordinate this with layer 2s and other Ethereum equivalent systems that run alt L1s? It presents a way for them to screw it up. I've seen Ethereum Classic screw up their forks. So I guarantee you that other people are going to screw up their forks if we add more complicated steps in it than just activate a new set of rules. Adding new data, people are always going to get that wrong. Is an irregular state change. And so you look at the contract, you could say, well, maybe we could just do a type 0 transaction and deploy it. The problem is that contract invokes the EOF create opcode, which means it's not valid under legacy, which then maybe we would need to compile it under EOF. But then the first byte is EF, which means it's going to be rejected. So there's no way to get it on there outside of an irregular state change, unless we again change the spec and change the rule on the 3541 rule. It says anything that begins with an EF, except for this specific contract, needs to be rejected. And there's, just to get this on there, there's still a lot of special cases. And we have to make a compromise somewhere. Either we have to make this contract allowable as a type 0. We have to do an illegal state change, not an irregular state change, or we have to have a different approach to the way we do the legacy contract creation codes. And so that's it. However we shake it, we're gonna have to make a compromise. It's gonna be weird. And my vote is we do the one that has the best user experience.
What are negative side of reusing legacy creator section? Or maybe better question, what were the benefits of using hard-coded contract? Because I don't see a lot of benefits by using current hard-coded contract that we wanted to use for TXCREATE.
So I don't think I'm the best one to advocate for the hard-coded contract, since I don't think it's the best solution.
Yeah.
I can speak to some of the positive things about it. I'm not sure I'm the best advocate.
Okay. Please continue. It's just discussion.
So yeah, I mean, one of the benefits of a hard-coded contract would be we keep the existing rules in the transaction code. And it also makes it obvious which systems support EOF, because you can just search for that contract. That's also a nice signal. But that gets into fork introspection, which is something that is also problematic on chain. It's useful to figure out if you support things like push zero, or whether you support blob transactions by executing those instructions and seeing if they fail. But you should know that before you deploy, unless you're using like viral style code being deployed out there. That's the only reason I would see the need for chain introspection.
Yeah. We can still check that if the init code is like EF or not. Maybe it's not like it's different, that having different type of transaction, but it still can be checked.
Yeah. And
Uh,
this whole getting extra data in is where I was willing to pull the plug on big EOF back in Shanghai, because that's when Solidity came to us and said, how do we write these codes so that we can add arbitrary data as part of the constructor arguments? Fixed data sizes are fine. If you say you have a pair contract with 2 pairs, you just supply a short EOF contract and let the tooling just append it like it always does to the calls. But as far as a cleaner solution, and that throws in problems when you do things like you have an array in the constructor, you have an array of contract owners, or an array of initial NFT recipients. So that doesn't scale up to more typical use cases. So that's, we in Austria, we discussed some of the options. This seemed to be one solution, but I'm still, I think it could work, but I think it would be a better solution to go with legacy transaction.
I would agree.
We probably
Because,
still need TXCREATE though. Yeah, go ahead, Dragon. I'll let you finish.
yeah, it's a lot easier to embed everything inside section pool, P2P. You don't need to have additional restriction, additional complexity that can be problematic. It's a lot easier to reuse whatever it is there. And I don't see a lot of downsides of reusing. I think the main benefit is that we already banned that byte that represent EOF, and that allows us to do something like this.
But just to be clear that we're not considering at this point dropping TXCREATE and initcode transactions, because they have a valid use case, which is for the smart contract wallets to deploy arbitrary EOF code.
Correct. I was about to say that. Yeah. So that's we still need TXCREATE.
So right now the battle is between the irregular state change creator contract solution versus allowing legacy transactions to deploy EOF, or legacy-like, because they're not really exactly. They do not copy. They do not have code introspection. This can be done like that, but yeah, Alex, you had some. Can you reiterate the arguments you had against this? What Dano is proposing? Because I didn't quite follow on Discord.
I'm not fully sure what solutions are being proposed. The initial design favored having the creator contract, also for the reason, assuming it would have a fixed address. that this would have been used across different chains, and that you could just send a transaction to it. But this was before the beacon block root contract was deployed, which in the end didn't happen to be at a like precompiled style address. And somewhat related, but not exactly related to EOF, are discussions around precompiles, where there's a proposal to have evmmax, and one proposal is that we can merge precompiles now, and they can be later replaced by, contracts, potentially using evmmax instructions. If we are not willing to make these kind of changes, like inserting precompiled style fixed code at fixed addresses, then that argument also kind of won't really stand. And definitely there is an example with the beacon block root contract that it didn't happen at a precompiled style address. I think this is the gist of it. I'm not sure what is the proposed solution if you're not having this fixed address. I mean, there's always the option what the beacon block root took, that one would mine an address, and that could also be, technically you could try to deploy it on multiple chains with the same transaction, as long as you fund the sender address. That's an option. Just the address wouldn't be, precompiled style. I'm not sure what other options are proposed.
The option is
So-
not to deploy the creator contract at all and use this legacy creation transaction with EOF to be an entry point that originally deploys any EOF.
So for me, the question is, how do we get
To
the creator
Yes.
contract on there without special rules? As written, it's using opcode ed, which is the EOF create, and that implies that it's going to have to be an EOF contract. And if there is no way to get a contract, if we can't deploy that via the existing create contract transactions, then there's no way to get it on there other than an irregular state change to say, when the fork activates, drop this in a particular address. Because we can't create a type 0 transaction that is chain independent to get the address out of that, because it doesn't have the proper address. We can't use like Micah's or Arachnid's create2 deployment, because the contract's going to go through a create2 validation, which is going to reject the EF beginning at the beginning of it. So there's a chicken and egg. If we could get that contract out there, then we could use it. But anything that we would do to get that contract out there would probably leave the door open, would need to leave the door open for other people coming in, or we need to specify that that door is only acceptable for the creator contract. It feels like unnecessary contortions to not just open it up to everyone.
So for using the legacy create, we had a proposal. I don't fully remember the specifics. We do have an HackMD about this, but it was kind of complicated and weird to, because basically in the creator contract and or EOF, we had, well, I think this was before the initcode, so maybe we could make it work. This was before the initcode list in the transaction. But it was some weird ways to, okay, just one step back. So what we have in EOF, we have with the proper transactions, we have a separation of call data and init code. And we really don't have that with the legacy create option. But in the HackMT, we did describe some ways to make it work, but it was still hacky. I can try to dig it up.
I would be very interested in reading this, but I mean, I think the approach that is kind of floating, it's not yet fully spec'd out, is for the call data to contain just the init code and not be available during execution. And then the call data would be substituted by the possibility to send whatever data is needed within the data section of the init container.
Oh, I remember one other reason we really hated it, because this basically makes code observable. Because once
No, it doesn't, I think.
I mean, this was before the TXCREATE. So if you still have TXCREATE, right, this is the case.
Yep. The code is not observable because the call data is just treated as if there was a magical TXCREATE that pointed, instead of the init code field of an init code transaction, it would point to the call data, and then the call data just vanishes at that point, except that it runs the init code. There's no way to access the call data anymore.
How you cannot use call data load?
Well, it's just
That's
empty
what
code
would need to
and
happen for this solution.
actually, Pavel mentioned that in legacy we wait, maybe I misunderstood what he was, but I think we can just erase this call data once the execution frame starts. And if you call data, then it's just as if the call data wasn't there. Does it make sense?
I mean, another option
Yeah.
would be to treat the aux data as call data and append the aux data and also make the aux data into the call data, but that might be too much. We could just set call data to 0 and require them to get everything from their data section, and I think that's reasonable.
Yep, Andrei, you are going to say something?
Yeah, I think that works. Not much to it. Stepping back a bit, I would say like this. So the benefits of irregular state change, as I see it, in deploying this creator contract is, so given that we anyway need TX create transactions, so with this irregular state change, we wouldn't need these legacy creation transactions supporting EOF. So it's not, we won't need two transaction kinds that will deploy EOF. So it's like a simpler in a way. And in general, just general argument, we are not mixing two worlds. So we don't deploy EOF from some legacy thing. It's only EOF can deploy EOF, right? So that was the goal of deploying this irregularly and then like only using EOF.
Why is
In a
that
way,
disallowed? Sorry for intruding, but
go ahead.
should we just allow create and create2 to create EOF and just require validation to be done on that bytecode that's created? This will allow any legacy or even legacy section to create EOF.
I mean, that would mean code observability, right?
Yep.
If you mean that create or create2's init code does return to deploy.
Yeah, and that's what we want to avoid, is people crafting an EOF contract in their legacy code and deploying that EOF contract. We only want, and this is for systems that use precompiled, that would do ahead of time compilation or ZK compilation of this. We want to make sure that when when a contract comes in the system, that it's gated by a transaction or it's already been known as part of a transaction. So if we allow create to create it, then at runtime, they might have an EOF contract created at runtime versus with allowing it either the legacy transaction or the initcode transaction. Then before the blockchain decides to accept that transaction into the system, it can know whether or not it's prepared for that particular contract code and reject it at the time of the transaction versus
Yeah.
rejecting it at runtime.
Yeah, and if it's inside the legacy contract, that means that some code are basically hard-coded. Okay. That makes sense.
I wouldn't also say that what we are proposing is mixing legacy and EOF, because such a transaction with empty2 and EOF init code sitting in the call data, it's pure EOF in terms of what it's being executed, and it's validated as it's almost the same as if there was a contract with a TXCREATE referring to a 0 element of the initcodes array, just like a hard-coded, very, very rigid deployer contract that only, instead of looking into the initcodes array, it looks into the call data and erases it afterwards. Like,
Could be a new transaction kind then, this, because it is in reality something very new.
would also be just to make it very explicit.
Yeah.
But it's like, I don't know, it's more psychological, I think, than it would still be the same thing.
Maybe simpler for tooling. I think that's what Dan mentioned. If it stays legacy creation, but I'm not very convinced. They will have to adapt anyway with all the EOF rules.
Yeah, I'm also I think the approach with a type 5, so to speak, but then what would be the to field of this transaction? It would not exist at all.
Yeah, no, because it's not needed.
Yeah. So it's also like a funny transaction kind. And that adapting tooling to this would probably be a more problematic part.
Maybe. So it looks like it's either a new transaction kind or irregular state change. That's the dilemma. And irregular state change happens once. Another transaction kind needs to be supported always. I'm on the fence about this. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
So okay.
Go ahead.
As I got more information what's going on, it seems irregular state change is better way, slightly better way.
I can't support an irregular state change. I saw the mess it caused last time. It's not something I can advocate for.
Yeah, but it's something that already happened. It's not out of scope. It's very sensitive topic because it can have very different outcomes. But I would look at this as deploying a precompile, something in that sense.
If it's literally written as a precompile, that's one thing. Putting code at a specific address, that's an ISC.
Maybe then we could think about that in precompile.
And again, precompile changes the hard hat and foundry workflow. And that's where we're going to meet with market rejection.
Yeah, but precompile is going to be embedded inside the REVM, and they will just use it without knowing what's inside.
So how is a precompile not an irregular state change?
Because you're not changing the state, you're changing the rules of the system. We already have set up these special addresses that are in the low numbers go to separate code. There's no state set in. There's just different rules for transaction processing. Putting in the code as written would be at a specific address, and it would be executed as though it was EVM code. But if you specified it outside of the context of EVM code and say it does this, then that would be a precompile without specifying an EVM code. I mean, we would need to approach it as nothing more than a precompile. And by the way, here's what the equivalent EVM might be like for it to be successful. But then they would want to have it at a hard-coded address. And the appetite on ACD for precompiles is low. I mean, the only reason we're getting these 10 precompiles for BLS is because it's absolutely required to validate effectively the consensus client stuff. And they don't view EOF with the same level of urgency as they do validating the CL blocks. We put more hoops to jump through to use this, and we're not going to ship it in prod. We need to be able to ship it with existing Foundry tools and with existing hard hat tools, or it's not going to get the acceptance it needs to get pushed into prod, and it's going to be another 2 years of work.
So I mean, all codevs practicalities aside, which I think a lot of what you said is true. I think generally what irregular state change means, yes, from like the textbook side, yes, you change the state. And from the textbook, yeah, maybe a precompile isn't, but what people were really figuring out prior to the beacon block root is modifying any state where you would never expect to have any modifications. And the precompile addresses are kind of implicitly expected to be populated over time. That's why I really don't get, I'm not talking specifically, about the EOF case, but that's why I don't get why there was no appetite to insert the beacon block root at that address, because those addresses are expected to change semantics and behavior. And whether you change that through an external specification or insert a code, it doesn't seem to make any difference, but it's beyond, this discussion.
I think one unique thing is it was also very specific to layer 1. Layer 2 and alt VMs don't have that. So having it be code that was dropped in and a system transaction handling it, it's Ethereum doing it. It's layer 1 mainnet doing mainnet things that none of the other networks need to worry about. So I think that's why it was more palatable, and people dropped resistance when that solution became available.
Yeah, we also over time. So what I would suggest is, I think we need to see like some rough spec, what alternative we could have, because otherwise it's really hard to discuss and agree on anything. So I think for next week, we need to come up with at least one alternative solution if we want to pursue this change.
I can
So what EIP would I post it against?
The spec is kind of almost ready, because this is the TXCREATE-less EOF proposal, which was a PR to EOF.md. You just need to not remove TXCREATE, basically. It probably has some rough edges, but I think that's what I at least had in mind for this. Because the TXCREATE-less EOF was exactly doing all deployments like that.
Yeah, that would be the initcode transaction. So the way we would handle contract create transactions, the type 1, 2, 3, you think 7620 is the right place for that? Or should we put it in the container definition?
Right now it's to the Megaspec.
Still in the Megaspec?
I would suggest the Megaspec because that's comprehensive and we see the
Yeah,
take
that's
great
all.
effect.
Yeah, I agree. Let's like it's more. It's easier to detect some conflict with some other part of the spec when you're working on the Megaspec. Even more so that some of the EIPs are not up to date yet.
So my concern with not putting in an EIP is that ACCT only considers EIPs right now. They don't like these extra mega specs for reference. So at some
No, I
point,
mean-
it's going to need to land in an EIP.
But this is
No,
for discussing next
absolutely.
week.
Yeah,
Discussion
this is
next week,
only
okay.
for our here discussions here,
Okay.
and then
All right.
translating this, we can make it a PR to the EIP 7620, which will be like just a chore to translate it to that form, or we can make it a new EIP altogether. But I would start with the Megaspec PR just for our discussion's sake.
Okay. So I have
And-
two items. I'll do the Megaspec update for the legacy create and the validation for
No,
empty.
this update to the Megaspec is almost it's
Done? Okay.
It's done. It just needs to get the TXCREATE-less PR to be stripped down of removing TXCREATE. So it's like 5 minutes work. I just get it done after the call or tomorrow early.
All right, we are almost 5 minutes over. Yeah, let's try to settle these questions next week, and hopefully we can start discussing it. Well, there's gonna be Easter holidays in most of Europe starting this weekend, so probably response rate gonna be low this week. But hopefully early next week we can start discussing this properly.
Yep.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Recording stopped.